My name is Isabelle Marchetti, and on the second Sunday of October, while my 80-year-old grandmother sat in the third pew of St. Anthony's Parish, singing the same hymns she'd sung every week for 51 years, a moving crew hired by my aunt and uncle emptied her house of everything she owned, and a real estate closing attorney finalized the sale of the only home she'd ever lived in as a married woman for $390,000, without her signature ever once appearing on a single document she'd actually agreed to. They called it a downsizing party when they picked her up from Mass 2 hours later and drove her straight to a small assisted living apartment they'd already furnished with a fraction of her belongings, walking her through the door to applause and a banner that read, "Welcome to your new chapter, Nonna," as though what had happened to her that morning was a celebration instead of a theft. I found out 4 days later when I drove to her house with a birthday card and found a for sale sign already replaced with a sold rider, and a stranger's minivan in the driveway where my grandfather's old Buick used to sit for 30 years after he died. Welcome back to True Family Drama, the channel for real stories of betrayal, justice, and the family members who thought an elderly woman's trust in her own children would keep her from ever finding out what they'd actually done to her. This is one of the more infuriating stories I've ever told, because it involves a woman who spent 80 years taking care of everyone else, discovering in the space of a single Sunday morning exactly how little that care was worth to the people she raised. Stay with me through this one, because the way it ended involved a home security camera, a parish sign-in sheet, and a judge who used the word elder fraud out loud in open court. If you're new here, subscribe, because there's a lot more like this waiting for you. To understand how two of my grandmother's own children orchestrated something like this, you have to understand my grandmother first, because Rosa Marchetti was never, in 80 years, a woman anyone should have believed would simply accept whatever was decided for her. My grandmother came to this country from a small town outside Naples when she was 19 years old, alone, speaking almost no English, carrying a single suitcase and a photograph of the man she'd married by proxy while he worked construction in America, saving enough to send for her. I want to describe that arrival in a bit more detail because I think it matters enormously to understanding the particular strength that made this entire betrayal even more painful when it finally happened. My grandmother told me the story of that crossing many times over the years, always with the same specific details: the 3 weeks on a ship whose name I've never quite managed to remember correctly, the seasickness that lasted nearly the entire voyage, arriving in a new country with exactly $40 sewn into the lining of her coat by her own mother, who told her, in the last conversation they ever had in person, that a smart woman always keeps something for herself that nobody else knows about. My grandmother met my grandfather for the first time in person at the pier, a man she'd only ever seen in a single photograph, and she used to tell me, laughing, that her first thought upon seeing him was relief that he actually resembled his photograph. Because plenty of girls I knew back home were not so lucky. She built an entire life from that single suitcase and that hidden $40, and I think, looking back, that early lesson about a smart woman always keeping something for herself is precisely the thing Connie and Frank managed to strip away from her, decades later, without her ever fully realizing it was happening until it was already gone. My grandfather, Antonio, bought the house on Deacon Street the year after she arrived, a modest 2-story colonial in a working-class neighborhood outside Providence, and my grandmother spent the next 58 years of her life inside its walls, raising 4 children, running a home daycare out of the basement for over 2 decades to help cover the mortgage. During years, my grandfather's construction work slowed, burying my grandfather from that same living room when he died of lung cancer 11 years ago, and continuing to live there alone afterward, fiercely, stubbornly independent, walking 6 blocks to St. Anthony's every single Sunday regardless of weather, tending a garden in the backyard that produced enough tomatoes every August to consauce for the entire extended family through the winter. I want to be clear about something before I go further, because I think it matters enormously to understanding what happened. Before I describe my grandmother's independence in strictly legal terms, I want to describe what an ordinary week actually looked like for her. because I think the specificity of her daily life is exactly what makes this entire betrayal so difficult to reconcile with any honest concern for her well-being. She woke most mornings at 6, made her own coffee in the same percolator she'd used since the 1970s rather than any of the newer machines her children had bought her over the years, and that sat, mostly unused, in a cabinet. She did the crossword in the local paper every day, in ink, a habit she was fiercely proud of and that I never once saw her fail to complete. She tended her garden through the warmer months with a precision that bordered on ceremonial, and every August, without fail, spent an entire weekend canning tomato sauce in mason jars she'd label by hand and distribute to every single one of her children and grandchildren before the season ended. A tradition that had, by the year all of this happened, spanned over 4 decades without interruption. She called each of her 4 children at least once a week, remembered every grandchild's school schedule and every important date on all our calendars better than most of us remembered them ourselves, and drove herself independently to a weekly hair appointment she'd kept with the same salon for over 15 years, chatting with the same hairdresser about neighborhood gossip and, in later years, increasingly, about the state of her own children's marriages and careers with the specific, loving bluntness only an Italian grandmother of her generation could deploy without ever quite meaning to be unkind. My grandmother was not incapacitated. She was not confused, was not suffering from any diagnosed cognitive decline, was not, by any medical or legal standard, someone who required a family member to make decisions on her behalf. She managed her own finances, balanced her own checkbook by hand the way my father, her own son, did until he died 2 years ago from the same heart condition that took him. She drove her own car, a 15-year-old sedan she maintained meticulously, to the grocery store, to church, to weekly visits with her sister in the next town over. She was, by every measure that should have mattered legally and morally, a fully independent, fully competent 80-year-old woman with every right to decide what happened to the house she'd lived in for 58 years. My Aunt Connie and my Uncle Frank, my father's younger siblings, the 2 of the 4 Marchetti children who'd stayed closest to home geographically over the decades, had been, for the better part of 3 years before any of this happened, quietly, persistently pushing my grandmother to consider selling the house and moving into assisted living. I want to describe the texture of that 3-year campaign in more detail, because I think it matters to understanding how deliberately this eventually escalated from ordinary family concern into calculated theft. It started, as far as I can piece together, innocuously enough. A comment at a holiday dinner about how big the house seemed for one person. A magazine article about aging in place versus community living that Connie left, somewhat pointedly, on my grandmother's kitchen table one visit. Over the following 2 years, though, the tenor of those conversations shifted, gradually, from gentle suggestion into something closer to pressure. My grandmother mentioned to me more than once during that period that Connie had started bringing up the topic almost every single visit, framing the house increasingly as a liability rather than a home, pointing out every small maintenance issue with exaggerated concern, mentioning, repeatedly, stories of elderly neighbors who'd fallen on stairs, building, I now understand in retrospect, a slow, cumulative case for a decision my grandmother had never actually agreed to make. I remember a specific Thanksgiving about 18 months before the sale, when my grandmother pulled me aside in her kitchen while carving the turkey, out of earshot of the rest of the family, and told me, with a note of genuine weariness I hadn't heard from her before, "Isabelle, Connie will not stop talking about this house like it is already a problem. I love my house. I am not ready. Why does nobody believe me when I say I am not ready?" I told her at the time that I believed her completely and that nobody could actually force her to sell a home she didn't want to sell. I said that with total confidence because at the time I genuinely believed it was true. I didn't yet understand that Connie and Frank had already begun exploring exactly the legal mechanism that would let them bypass her stated wishes entirely, regardless of how many times she said the word no. I want to be fair here and acknowledge that some version of that concern was, on its surface, reasonable. My grandmother was 80, living alone in a two-story house with a basement she rarely used, and stairs that, admittedly, had become more difficult for her to manage in recent years. A reasonable, honest conversation about her long-term living situation was not, in itself, an unreasonable thing for her adult children to want to have with her. What made this story a betrayal rather than ordinary family concern was not the conversation itself. It was the fact that my aunt and uncle stopped having the conversation entirely at some point and simply decided to make the decision for her, without her knowledge, without her consent, and as it would turn out, using a legal document she never actually agreed to sign in the way they later claimed she had. I need to explain the mechanism of what they did, because it's the hinge this entire story turns on, and because I think understanding it clearly matters for anyone watching who has an aging parent or grandparent of their own. About 4 months before the sale, my Aunt Connie had taken my grandmother to what she described, at the time, as a routine appointment to update some paperwork with Frank's lawyer friend, just in case anything ever happens, so we're not scrambling. My grandmother, trusting, as she'd always been trusting of her own children, went along without asking many questions, the way any 80-year-old woman might reasonably trust that her own daughter wouldn't misuse her signature. What my grandmother believed she was signing, based on what she later told me, and, crucially, what she later testified to under oath, was a standard durable power of attorney, a document many elderly people reasonably sign, granting a trusted family member the authority to make decisions on their behalf only in the event of incapacity, a common and often genuinely prudent piece of estate planning. What my aunt and uncle had actually had her sign, buried in language on page 4 of a document my grandmother, who read English capably but not with a native speaker's fluency, had not fully parsed on her own and had been given no independent legal counsel to review, was a springing power of attorney with an unusually broad activation clause, one that didn't require a doctor's formal determination of incapacity to take effect, as most such documents legally should, but instead activated based on what the document itself vaguely described as the reasonable judgment of the designated agents regarding the principal's capacity to manage her affairs, a standard so loose and so entirely self-determined by Connie and Frank themselves that it functioned, in practice, as almost no safeguard at all. 2 attorneys I later consulted independently both used some version of the same phrase to describe that clause once they saw it, a loophole wide enough to drive a moving truck through, which is, quite literally, exactly what my aunt and uncle eventually did. I want to walk you through the months leading up to the sale, because the deliberateness of what happened matters enormously, and I don't want to condense it into something that sounds more spontaneous than it actually was. Over the following 4 months, according to records I'd later obtained through discovery, my aunt and uncle had listed the house with a real estate agent, a family friend of Uncle Frank's conveniently, without my grandmother's knowledge, scheduled and conducted showings during hours. My grandmother was reliably out of the house, at church, at her sister's, at her weekly hair appointment, and negotiated an accepted offer, all of it happening in the physical space my grandmother still occupied every single day, invisible to her because it was deliberately scheduled around the narrow windows when she wasn't home to notice. I found out about all of this not because anyone in my family told me directly, but because of an accident of timing that, looking back, feels like the only piece of luck in this entire story. I'd driven to my grandmother's house on a random Thursday afternoon, 4 days after the sale had actually closed, intending to drop off a birthday card early since I'd be traveling for work on her actual birthday the following week. I want to describe the specific disorientation of that drive up Deacon Street, because I think it captures something important about how quietly, how completely, this entire betrayal had already been executed by the time I stumbled into it. The lawn, which my grandmother tended as fiercely as her garden, looked freshly mowed by someone who clearly wasn't her, since she always left the grass slightly longer than most of her neighbors, a small personal preference I'd teased her about my whole life. A sold rider hung across a for sale sign I hadn't even known existed, and in the driveway where my grandfather's old blue Buick had sat, unmoved, for 11 years since his death, because my grandmother refused to sell it, calling it keeping him company in the yard. There was a stranger's minivan instead. I sat in my car outside that house for nearly 10 minutes before I could make myself do anything, my hands genuinely shaking, trying to construct some innocent explanation for what I was looking at and failing, completely, to come up with one. I called my grandmother's cell phone. She answered, and her voice when she picked up had a strange, hollow quality to it that I'd never heard from her before in my entire life. Not confused exactly, but flattened. The specific tone of a person still actively processing something too large to have fully landed yet. She told me when I asked where she was that she was at the new apartment, the one Connie and Frank set up. I asked her what she meant by the new apartment. There was a long pause on the line, and then she said, in a voice that broke something in my chest permanently, "Isabelle, I don't understand what happened to my house." I drove to the assisted living facility immediately, a 40-minute drive I don't fully remember making, arriving to find my grandmother sitting alone in a small, unfamiliar one-bedroom apartment, surrounded by perhaps a fifth of her actual belongings. A few photographs, a handful of kitchen items, none of the furniture she'd chosen herself over decades, none of the countless small objects that had made her house specifically hers rather than simply a collection of rooms. She told me, piecing together a timeline that I'd later corroborate through independent evidence, that she had gone to Sunday Mass that morning exactly as she did every week, that Connie had picked her up afterward as planned, for lunch, and a little surprise, and that the surprise had turned out to be a small gathering of family and neighbors at the assisted living facility, complete with a banner, a cake, and an explanation delivered to her, in front of that gathered crowd, that the house had already been sold, that everything had already been handled, and that she should be grateful, Connie told her, in front of everyone. "For how much stress this saves you at your age, Mama." I want to sit with that phrase for a moment, because I think it captures something essential about how my aunt had chosen to frame this entire theft, both to my grandmother and, I'd later learn, to the rest of the family who hadn't yet found out the full truth. Connie had constructed a narrative in which selling my grandmother's house without her knowledge or genuine consent was an act of generosity, a burden lifted rather than a theft committed, and she had done so publicly in front of witnesses, specifically so that any objection my grandmother might raise in that moment would read, to the assembled crowd, as ingratitude rather than legitimate shock at having just discovered her own home had vanished out from under her while she sat in a church pew. My grandmother, in that moment, surrounded by smiling relatives and a banner reading, "Welcome to your new chapter," did not make a scene. I've thought about that choice of hers many times since, and I don't think it reflects acceptance so much as it reflects 80 years of a specific generational instinct toward not embarrassing her own children in public, an instinct I understand intimately because I watched it shape nearly every difficult moment of her life. She smiled, thanked everyone for coming, and waited until the apartment emptied out that evening before she allowed herself, alone for the first time since Mass that morning, to fully understand what had actually happened to her. I confronted Connie the following day, calling her before I'd even fully processed my own shock. My voice, I'm told by my husband who overheard the call, shaking with a fury I don't think I'd ever expressed toward a family member in my entire adult life. Connie's response, and I want to walk you through it carefully because it matters to understanding exactly what kind of justification she'd built for herself, was calm, almost rehearsed, the tone of someone who had clearly anticipated this exact confrontation and prepared for it in advance. She told me that she and Frank held valid power of attorney, that the sale had been entirely within our legal authority, that Mama wasn't managing the stairs well anymore and everyone knew it, and that they'd chosen to handle it the way they did specifically to spare her the emotional burden of packing up 58 years of memories herself, a burden Connie framed throughout the entire conversation as something she'd generously absorbed on my grandmother's behalf rather than something she'd stolen from her entirely. I asked Connie directly whether my grandmother had actually agreed to sell the house, in any meaningful, informed sense, before any of it happened. There was a pause, longer than I think Connie intended to let show, and then she said, "She signed the power of attorney. That's her agreement." I want you to notice the way I noticed in that exact moment, standing in my kitchen with my hand shaking around my phone, that Connie's answer wasn't actually an answer to the question I'd asked. I hadn't asked whether a document existed. I'd asked whether my grandmother had genuinely, knowingly agreed to sell her home. Connie's answer substituted the existence of paperwork for the existence of actual consent. Exactly the same substitution, I'd later realize with a kind of sick recognition, that Christine had made with Renee's forged signature, that Constance had made with her trustee memo, a pattern I've since come to understand runs through nearly every story of this kind. Someone deciding that the technical existence of a document is close enough to genuine agreement that the difference between the two simply stops mattering to them. I want to pause here and talk directly to you for a moment, because I know some of you watching have an aging parent or grandparent in your own life, and I think this story carries a specific urgency for exactly that reason. Elder financial exploitation, I would learn over the following months, is disturbingly common and disturbingly underreported, precisely because it so often happens exactly the way it happened to my grandmother, perpetrated not by strangers, but by the family members an elderly person trusts most completely, wrapped in language about care and burden lifting that makes the theft difficult to name clearly, even to the victim herself, who has spent a lifetime trained not to believe her own children capable of something this calculated. I retained an elder law attorney within the week, a sharp, deeply experienced woman named Patricia Nakamura Reyes, who specialized specifically in elder financial exploitation cases, recommended by a social worker at the assisted living facility itself. A woman named Denise, who had, I would later learn, quietly flagged concerns about my grandmother's situation to her own supervisor within days of the move-in, troubled by the specific mismatch between my grandmother's evident cognitive clarity and the sudden, unexplained relocation from a lifelong home. I want to describe my first meeting with Patricia in more detail, because I think it was the moment I finally stopped feeling purely like a devastated granddaughter and started feeling like someone capable of actually fighting for my grandmother in the way this situation demanded. Patricia's office occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian house near the county courthouse, a location that felt, oddly, appropriate given how much of this case would eventually turn on exactly the kind of quiet, small-town institutional memory a place like that seemed to embody. She listened to my entire account without interrupting, taking careful notes in a looping, old-fashioned handwriting that reminded me, unexpectedly, of my grandmother's own. When I finished, she set down her pen and said, "I've handled maybe 40 cases like this over my career, and I want to tell you something that I think will matter to you as we move forward. The cases that actually succeed almost never succeed because the victim finally speaks up loudly enough. They succeed because somewhere in the ordinary daily record of a person's life, a security camera, a sign-in sheet, a receipt, a scheduling log, there exists a piece of evidence nobody thought to hide, because nobody involved in the theft ever imagined anyone would look that closely. Our job now is to find that evidence before it disappears." I didn't fully understand in that first meeting how prophetic that sentence would turn out to be. Patricia's first move was to request the complete power of attorney document and the entire closing file from the real estate transaction, and what she found, laid side by side, told a story even more damning than what Connie had already admitted to on the phone. The power of attorney document itself, Patricia noted immediately, showed clear signs of what she described as predatory drafting, the vague, self-determined incapacity trigger I've already described, combined with a notarization that, troublingly, listed a notary public who, it would turn out, was Uncle Frank's own paralegal at the small title insurance company where he worked. A detail that raised immediate questions about whether proper independent identity and capacity verification had actually occurred at signing, the same kind of procedural shortcut I'd note with a strange sense of déjà vu that had undone Renee's sister Christine's forgery in an earlier story on this very channel. Though this situation, crucially, involved something even more layered, not an outright forgery, but a document my grandmother had genuinely signed, without ever understanding the specific breadth of authority buried inside it. I want to describe the specific afternoon Patricia walked me through the power of attorney document line by line, because it clarified, more than anything else in this entire process, exactly how deliberately this had been constructed. She pulled up a standard, properly drafted durable power of attorney template on her computer screen, the kind most reputable elder law attorneys actually use, and set it beside the document Connie and Frank had presented to my grandmother, showing me, point by point, exactly where the two diverged. A proper document, she explained, requires a physician's written determination of incapacity before the agent's authority activates. An objective, medical, third-party standard specifically designed to prevent exactly what had happened to my grandmother. The document she'd actually signed replaced that standard with language granting Connie and Frank themselves the authority to determine, in their reasonable judgment, when she'd become unable to manage her own affairs, with no outside verification required whatsoever. "This isn't sloppy drafting, Isabelle," Patricia told me, and I remember the specific chill of hearing her say it out loud. "Sloppy drafting happens by accident. This is drafting done by someone who understood exactly what protection they were removing, and removed it anyway, on purpose." Patricia's second discovery mattered even more to the eventual case. Reviewing the real estate closing file, she found that the listing agreement, the showings, and the eventual purchase and sale agreement had all been executed and scheduled entirely by Connie and Frank acting under the power of attorney, with my grandmother's name appearing only as principal by attorney in fact. A standard and often legitimate practice when someone genuinely cannot manage their own affairs. But Patricia flagged something crucial buried in the timeline itself. The power of attorney document had been signed in June. The listing had gone live in July, barely a month later, with showings conducted almost exclusively, according to the real estate agent's own scheduling logs, which Patricia subpoenaed, during Sunday mornings between 9 and 11, and Tuesday afternoons between 2 and 4, windows that, once cross-referenced against my grandmother's own weekly routine, corresponded precisely to her regular mass attendance and her standing weekly hair appointment, the 2 blocks of time each week she was reliably, predictably out of the house. I want to describe the moment Patricia showed me that scheduling pattern laid out on a single page, because it's the moment this entire ordeal stopped feeling, to me, like a family disagreement about elder care and started feeling like exactly what it was. A deliberate, calculated operation, planned around my grandmother's own trusted, predictable habits, specifically designed to keep her from ever encountering evidence of her own house being shown to strangers while she still lived inside it. "This isn't the pattern of 2 adult children genuinely worried about their mother's well-being," Patricia told me, tapping the page. "This is the pattern of 2 people who knew, on some level, that if their mother found out what they were doing before it was finished, she would have stopped them. That's not care, Isabelle. That's concealment, and concealment this deliberate is the kind of evidence a court takes very seriously." The most damning piece of evidence, though, the one that ultimately made the difference between a difficult, drawn-out civil dispute and a case with genuine criminal weight behind it, came from an unexpected source. The way I think it always seems to in stories like this. Not from anyone inside my family, but from a neighbor. Mr. Delgado had lived 2 doors down from my grandmother on Deacon Street for over 20 years. A retired postal worker with the specific, watchful habits of a man who'd spent 30 years noticing which houses on his route seemed right and which seemed slightly off. I want to describe Mr. Delgado himself a bit more, because I think the specific ordinariness of his life makes what his footage ended up accomplishing feel even more remarkable in retrospect. He'd retired from the Postal Service 6 years earlier after 31 years of the same route, a fact he mentioned proudly within the first 5 minutes of any conversation I ever had with him. He lived alone since his wife had passed, filled his days with a woodworking hobby in his garage, and a fierce, long-standing rivalry with the man across the street over whose tomato plants produced better fruit each summer. a rivalry my own grandmother had apparently been quietly aware of and found endlessly amusing for years without either man realizing she knew. He'd installed the security camera, as I mentioned, purely out of frustration over a stolen Amazon package the previous winter, a mundane, almost comically small motivation given what that same camera would eventually help uncover. He'd installed a home security camera on his own porch 2 years earlier. Primarily, he told Patricia when she eventually reached out to him. Because of package theft, nothing more dramatic than that. A camera whose field of view happened, entirely by accident of geography, to capture a clear angle on my grandmother's driveway and front walk. I want to describe the actual moment Patricia first reached out to Mr. Delgado because he later recounted it to me himself, sitting on his own porch, in a way I've never forgotten. He told her, when she explained why she was calling, that he'd actually noticed the moving truck himself that Sunday morning, had thought it was strange given that he knew my grandmother wasn't planning to move anywhere, but had assumed, in the moment, that it must simply be some family arrangement he wasn't aware of, the kind of assumption good neighbors make about each other's business every day without a second thought. I almost said something to her the next time I saw her out in the yard, he told me later, shaking his head slowly. I wish to God I had, but I figured it wasn't my place to ask, and I never imagined, not for 1 second, that it was anything other than her own family helping her out. When Patricia contacted him, explaining the situation, Mr. Delgado didn't hesitate. He still had months of archived footage stored automatically on a cloud service he'd frankly forgotten he was paying for, and within it, time-stamped and unambiguous, was footage from the actual Sunday of the sale. A moving truck arriving at 9:47 in the morning, roughly 15 minutes after my grandmother's usual departure time for Mass, and departing, fully loaded, at 11:52, well before her typical return home. The footage showed, in addition, several individuals Patricia was able to identify through later testimony as the moving crew Connie and Frank had hired, along with a brief, damning appearance by Connie herself, standing on the porch directing the crew, checking her watch repeatedly in a way that, watching the footage myself for the first time, made my stomach turn in a way I don't think I'll ever fully forget. I want to tell you about watching that footage for the first time because it's one of the moments from this entire ordeal I still think about most. Patricia played it for me in her office, and I remember watching my aunt, a woman who had held me as a baby, who had taught me to make my grandmother's meatball recipe one summer when I was 14, standing on my grandmother's porch checking her watch like a woman timing a robbery, which, in every meaningful sense, is exactly what she was doing. I didn't cry watching it. I felt something colder than crying, a kind of clarity that I imagine every person telling a story on this channel eventually reaches. The moment abstract betrayal becomes an image you can't unsee, time-stamped, undeniable, moving in real time across a screen. The final piece of corroborating evidence, and I think, in some ways, the piece that mattered most to my grandmother personally, even more than the legal weight it carried, came from St. Anthony's Parish itself. My grandmother, it turned out, had been part of a small, informal ministry that maintained a sign-in sheet each week for parishioners who helped with the coffee hour following Mass, a task she'd volunteered for every single Sunday for over a decade. The sign-in sheet from that specific Sunday, which the parish secretary, a warm, sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Feeney, who had known my grandmother for over 20 years, still had on file, showed my grandmother's own signature, time-stamped by the coffee hour's typical 9:30 start, placing her definitively, undeniably, inside that church at the exact same moment a moving truck was emptying her house of 58 years of belongings 2 miles away. Mrs. Feeney, when Patricia contacted her, was, by her own account, absolutely furious on my grandmother's behalf, and volunteered, entirely unprompted, to testify to my grandmother's consistent, decades-long presence and clarity of mind at every single service she'd attended, a character witness whose only interest in the entire matter was the plain, unglamorous truth of a woman she'd watched faithfully attend her parish for over half a century. Armed with the power of attorney's predatory drafting, the deliberately concealed scheduling pattern, Mr. Delgado's footage, and Mrs. Feeney's sign-in sheet, Patricia filed simultaneously on 2 fronts, a strategy she explained to me carefully before we proceeded, because I hadn't fully understood until she walked me through it. that a situation like this could actually be pursued as both a civil and a criminal matter at once. On the civil side, she filed a petition to void the power of attorney entirely on grounds of what the law describes as undue influence and lack of informed consent, along with a claim for the return of the house's full value since the property itself had already, unfortunately, been sold to a good-faith third-party buyer who had done nothing wrong and whose purchase, Patricia advised, was not realistically going to be unwound the way Renee's stepson-forged sale had been in an earlier story. The buyers here had negotiated in good faith directly with attorneys in fact, who held, at least on paper, apparently valid legal authority, a critical difference that meant Connie and Frank, not the innocent buyers, would bear the full financial consequence. On the criminal side, Patricia worked directly with the county's elder abuse unit, a specialized division that, I learned during this process, exists in many jurisdictions specifically because financial exploitation of elderly people by their own family members has become common enough to warrant dedicated prosecutorial attention. Detective Marguerite Solano, an investigator with over a decade of experience specifically in elder financial crimes, took the case personally once she reviewed Mr. Delgado's footage and the scheduling pattern Patricia had assembled, telling me in our first meeting, a sentence that has stayed with me since. I've been doing this work for 11 years, and the cases that get me out of bed every morning are exactly this one, not the strangers who scam elderly people over the phone, though God knows there's plenty of that too, but the families who do this to their own parents and dress it up as love. Those are the ones that actually make me angry because the victim almost never wants to believe it, even with the evidence sitting right in front of her. I want to describe the conversation I eventually had to have with my grandmother about pursuing criminal charges against her own daughter and son, because it was, without question, the hardest conversation of this entire ordeal, harder even than the day I first found the sold sign in her driveway. My grandmother, even after everything, even after watching Mr. Delgado's footage herself, sitting beside me in Patricia's office with her hands folded tightly in her lap, resisted the idea of criminal charges for weeks, telling me, in the specific, worn language of a mother who has spent 80 years finding reasons to forgive her own children, "Isabelle, she is still my daughter. I don't want her to go to jail. I just want my house back, and I know I can't have that." I sat with her through that resistance for a long time, not pushing, because I understood, even in my own anger, that this decision belonged to her and not to me, however much I personally wanted to see Connie and Frank held fully accountable for what they'd done. What ultimately changed my grandmother's mind, and I think this detail matters enormously to understanding who she actually is underneath the quiet, uncomplaining exterior she'd maintained her entire life, wasn't anger on her own behalf at all. It was Detective Solano gently informing her, during one of their meetings, that elder financial exploitation cases like hers, when they go unprosecuted, statistically tend to embolden the people who commit them, and that Connie and Frank, having gotten away with this once, would very likely, in Detective Solano's professional experience, attempt something similar again, either against my grandmother herself if she ever regained any meaningful assets, or, more likely, against some other vulnerable elderly relative or acquaintance down the line, once they'd learned from this experience exactly how easily a plausible-sounding power of attorney and a carefully concealed timeline could accomplish this kind of theft. My grandmother, who had spent 58 years in that house partly running an informal daycare for half the neighborhood's children, who had spent decades quietly looking after every vulnerable person who crossed her path, could not in the end tolerate the idea that her own silence might protect her children long enough for them to do this to someone else. "If not for me," she told Patricia and Detective Solano at that meeting, in a sentence I've thought about many times since, "then for whoever they would do this to next." The legal process that followed took just under a year, longer than any of us wanted, but not, Patricia assured me repeatedly, unusually long for a case with this much financial and evidentiary complexity. On the civil side, the court voided the power of attorney entirely, finding in a written ruling that used the phrase clear and convincing evidence of undue influence and deliberate concealment that Connie and Frank had breached their fiduciary duty as attorneys in fact in a manner that went well beyond ordinary poor judgment. The court ordered them to return the full net proceeds of the sale, $390,000 minus reasonable closing costs, to my grandmother directly, along with covering her legal fees, a judgment that, because Connie and Frank had already spent a significant portion of the money on their own homes and debts by that point, ultimately required liens against their own properties to satisfy over time, a slow, painful, but genuinely enforceable form of restitution. On the criminal side, Connie and Frank were both charged with financial exploitation of an elderly person, a felony in our state given the dollar amount involved. Facing Mr. Delgado's footage, Mrs. Feeney's sign-in sheet, and the predatory drafting of the power of attorney itself, both ultimately accepted plea agreements rather than risk trial. Connie to a reduced charge involving a suspended sentence, 5 years of probation, and a formal restitution order layered on top of the civil judgment, and Frank, whose paralegal's notarization of the document had raised additional professional misconduct questions that eventually cost him his job at the title insurance company entirely, to a similar arrangement with an additional period of community service specifically focused on elder services, a detail the judge included, I was told by Patricia afterward, quite deliberately, as a form of court-mandated confrontation with exactly the population he'd chosen to exploit. I want to describe the criminal trial preparation period in a bit more detail before moving to the sentencing hearing itself, because it involved one more discovery that mattered enormously to how the case ultimately unfolded. About 2 months before the plea agreements were finalized, Detective Solano's investigation uncovered a series of text messages between Connie and Frank, obtained through a properly executed warrant that laid bare, in a way none of the other evidence quite managed to, exactly how deliberate their planning had actually been. In one message, dated roughly 6 weeks before the sale, Connie had written to Frank, "We need to do this on a Sunday while she's at church. It's the only 2 hours we can count on every single week." Frank had responded, "Agreed, and let's make sure the movers are gone before the afternoon, so there's no chance of a neighbor mentioning it to her before we're ready to explain it ourselves." I want to sit with that exchange for a moment because I think it's the single piece of evidence in this entire case that most completely destroyed any remaining possibility of framing what happened as good faith, if misguided, family concern. These were not 2 people accidentally scheduling around their mother's routine. These were 2 people explicitly, in writing, discussing how to exploit her most sacred, predictable weekly ritual, her faith, the same faith that had carried her across an ocean and through 58 years of a hard life, as a tactical window for theft. Patricia showed me those texts before they became public record, sitting across from me in her office with an expression I hadn't seen from her before, something closer to genuine anger than the careful professional composure she usually maintained. "I've read a lot of ugly text messages in this line of work, Isabelle," she told me. "This is one of the ugliest because of what they chose to exploit. Not just her trust, her faith specifically. They picked the 2 hours a week she was least likely to ever find out, and the reason those 2 hours existed at all was because she was at Mass, doing the one thing she'd done faithfully for 51 years without fail." I remember sitting with that realization for a long time after leaving her office, understanding, fully, for the first time, that this hadn't been a hasty, poorly considered decision made under some genuine if misguided belief that they were helping her. It had been calculated in writing weeks in advance, with her own devotion used as the specific mechanism of its own betrayal. I want to describe the sentencing hearing itself because it's the moment in this entire ordeal that more than any other has stayed with me. My grandmother attended, seated beside me in the second row, wearing the same simple navy dress she wore to Mass most Sundays, her hands folded in her lap in the same posture I'd watched her hold through 58 years of hard, unglamorous life. When the judge asked whether the victim wished to make a statement before sentencing, my grandmother stood, slowly, with the help of her cane, and spoke for less than 2 minutes, in English still lightly accented by the Italian she'd carried across an ocean 61 years earlier. She didn't ask for harsh punishment. She didn't perform grief for the courtroom. She said simply that she had given 58 years of her life to that house, that she had given considerably more than 58 years of her life to her own children, and that the hardest part of the entire ordeal was not losing a house, but learning, at 80 years old, that the people she had given the most to were the same people who had decided, without ever asking her, that her own wishes about her own life no longer mattered enough to consult. "I forgive you," she told Connie and Frank directly, her voice steady in a way that made the entire courtroom go still. "Because I am your mother, and that does not stop just because you stopped acting like my children. But forgiving you does not mean I will pretend it did not happen. I want the court, and I want you, to understand exactly what you did, clearly, out loud, so that none of us ever gets to forget it." My relationship with my grandmother, if anything, has grown deeper through this entire ordeal, in a way I don't think either of us expected, but that I've come to be genuinely grateful for. We speak nearly every day now, a habit that began during the year of legal proceedings out of sheer necessity and simply never stopped once the case concluded. She's taught me, over long afternoons in her newly furnished apartment, how to properly make her tomato sauce from scratch, the same recipe she once used to distribute in hand-labeled mason jars every August, insisting I write down every step in my own hand rather than simply watching her do it, because, she told me, recipes only really belong to you once your own hand has written them down, not just your memory. I understood, hearing her say that she was talking about considerably more than tomato sauce. I want to tell you what happened with the restitution money because I think it matters as much as the ruling itself. My grandmother did not buy another house, though she certainly could have with the returned funds. She told me, sitting in her small assisted living apartment a few months after the sentencing, that something in her no longer wanted the burden of an empty house built for a family that had, in the end, betrayed her inside its own walls. Instead, she used a portion of the settlement to fully furnish and personalize her apartment, finally with pieces that actually reflected her rather than the sparse handful Connie had originally provided, and donated a significant portion, a decision entirely her own, made without any input from me, to St. Anthony's Parish, specifically earmarked at her request for a small emergency fund the parish could use to help elderly parishioners facing housing instability, a fund the parish eventually named, over her strenuous, embarrassed objections, the Rosa Marchetti Fund. My relationship with Connie and Frank has not survived this, and I don't believe it ever will. Not in any form I'd recognize as an actual relationship. I've made peace with that loss more easily than I expected to, honestly, because I think watching that security footage for the first time did something permanent to how I understood who they actually were underneath the family roles I'd assigned them my entire life. My grandmother's relationship with them exists now in a much smaller, more careful form than it once did. Brief, supervised holiday visits, mostly for the sake of my own children and Connie's grandchildren, who deserve some continuity even if the adults around them have permanently, irreparably changed how they see each other. My grandmother has told me more than once that she has forgiven them in the specific religious sense that matters deeply to her faith, while also being entirely clear-eyed in every practical sense about never again extending them the kind of unquestioning trust she once did. I want to describe one more scene before I close this out, because it's the moment that, more than any court ruling, felt like the actual emotional conclusion of this entire ordeal. About 4 months after the sentencing, I drove my grandmother back to Deacon Street at her own request, something she'd never asked to do in all the months since the sale, telling me only that she needed to see it once, properly, before I can stop carrying it around in my chest. The new owners, a young couple with a toddler who had, by complete coincidence, purchased the house entirely in good faith with no knowledge of the circumstances behind its sale, happened to be out in their front yard when we pulled up, and my grandmother, after a long moment of simply looking at the house from the car, asked if we could get out. I want to describe what happened next carefully, because I think it says more about who my grandmother actually is than almost anything else in this entire story. She walked up to the young couple, introduced herself simply as the woman who used to live here for 58 years, and asked, gently, whether the tomato plants in the backyard, the ones she'd tended for 4 decades, were still producing anything. The young wife, visibly moved by the specific weight of the question, walked my grandmother around back herself, and I watched, from a respectful distance, as my 81-year-old grandmother knelt down in soil she'd worked for most of her adult life, examining plants that were, remarkably, still bearing fruit from cuttings and roots she'd established decades earlier, long before any of this had happened to her. She didn't cry. She simply knelt there for a long moment, touching the leaves the way you might touch an old friend's hand, and then stood, thanked the young couple for keeping the garden alive, and told them, with a warmth that startled me given everything she'd been through, that she hoped their little girl would grow up loving that backyard the way her own children once had before everything else happened. On the drive back to her apartment, she was quiet for a long time, and then she said simply, "The tomatoes remembered me, even if my children didn't." I didn't have anything to say to that. I just held her hand the rest of the way home. I think about Mr. Delgado often. The way I imagine every person telling a story like this eventually thinks about whichever ordinary person's quiet attentiveness became the hinge their whole situation turned on. A retired postal worker who installed a camera to stop package theft and ended up, entirely by accident, providing the single piece of evidence that proved a calculated theft far larger than anything he'd originally worried about. I brought him a plate of my grandmother's meatballs myself, the same recipe Connie had once taught me, delivered by my own hands instead, because some ironies feel too important not to lean into deliberately. He told me, standing in his doorway, that he'd almost deleted that footage automatically, the way his camera's storage settings usually cycled out old files after 90 days, and that the only reason it still existed when Patricia called was a firmware update that had accidentally reset his storage settings to keep files longer than he'd originally configured. I've thought about that detail more than almost anything else in this entire story. That the evidence which finally protected my grandmother existed in the end, because of a random software glitch nobody intended. A reminder that the margin between justice and permanent, undiscovered theft is sometimes thinner and more accidental than any of us would like to believe. I want to close with something my grandmother said to me only once, months after everything had concluded, sitting together at her kitchen table in the new apartment over 2 cups of the coffee she still made in that same old percolator, a small piece of continuity she'd insisted on keeping regardless of everything else that had changed. She told me that the hardest part of the entire ordeal, harder even than losing the house itself, had been the specific, quiet realization that trust, once given completely across an entire lifetime, does not actually protect you the way you assume it will. "I trusted them because they were my children," she said. "I did not think trust needed proof. Now I understand. Proof is not the opposite of trust, Isabelle. Proof is what lets trust survive contact with people who might not deserve it. I've carried that distinction with me since, in ways that extend well beyond this single story, and I suspect, watching this channel as long as some of you have, that you understand exactly what she meant without my needing to explain it further. I also want to mention, because I think it matters to how this story actually ends, rather than how it merely concludes legally, that my grandmother celebrated her 81st birthday 6 weeks after the sentencing in her new apartment, surrounded by a smaller but far more honest gathering than the downsizing party that had once tried to celebrate her own erasure. I baked the cake myself, badly, using a recipe she talked me through over the phone step by step, correcting my technique the entire time with the specific, loving exasperation only a grandmother who has spent 81 years perfecting her own version of a thing can summon. It wasn't a large party. It wasn't a banner and crowd affair the way the fraudulent one had been. It was 4 of us, her closest remaining family, sitting around a small table eating an imperfect cake, and I remember thinking, watching her blow out her candles, that this small, genuine gathering was worth infinitely more than the elaborate, hollow performance Connie had once staged to celebrate a theft dressed up as generosity. That's my story. My aunt and uncle sold my 80-year-old grandmother's house out from under her while she sat in church, using a power of attorney she never fully understood the scope of, and it took a neighbor's forgotten security camera and a parish coffee hour sign-in sheet to prove definitively what they'd actually done. If you've ever watched someone treat an elderly parent's trust as an opportunity rather than a responsibility, I want you to hear this clearly. Age does not erase the right to be consulted about your own life, And love that requires deceiving someone in order to spare them is not love at all. It's control, dressed up in a banner that says, "Welcome to your new chapter." If this story moved you, subscribe to True Family Drama. Tell me in the comments whether you've ever had to fight to protect someone who spent their whole life protecting everyone else. And I'll see you in the next one.